I thought moving here would be peaceful. Quiet mornings, friendly neighbors, and the place to finally breathe. But that dream shattered the moment the HOA came knocking. It started with a warning slip tucked under my door, then the late-night photos, the anonymous complaints, and the feeling that someone was watching my every move. I wasn't breaking any rules, or at least I didn't think I was, but they were determined to break me. What happens when the people meant to protect your community decide you are the enemy?
When Jake and Emily first drove down the winding road into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like stepping into a postcard. The neighborhood was carved into the edge of a quiet valley, where oak trees stretched their limbs over clean sidewalks and kids raced their bikes between cul-de-sacs. Every lawn seemed trimmed with surgical precision, and every porch had the same hanging flower baskets swaying in the breeze, as if they'd all agreed on what perfect should look like. To Jake, who'd spent years working double shifts in the city, this place wasn't just a home. It was the reward at the end of a long, punishing grind. He pictured lazy Sunday mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, watching his dog chase squirrels across the wide-open yard. Emily imagined their future kids running barefoot in the grass, neighbors waving as they passed. It felt safe, predictable, maybe even a little too perfect. But they didn't care. That was the point. After years of chaos, perfection sounded wonderful. At first, it really was. They learned the names of the couples on either side, the Millers with their towering roses, and the Grants who hosted block parties every summer. There were welcome baskets, polite smiles, even a community newsletter slipped into their mailbox each month with cheerful headlines about garden contests and bake sales. It all seemed harmless, almost sweet. Still, every once in a while, Jake noticed small things that didn't quite fit. Like the way people's eyes lingered just a little too long on their front yard, or how the Millers' smiles tightened whenever their dog barked. One evening, as he hauled a new bench onto the porch, a man he didn't recognize slowed his car, rolled down the window, and stared for a beat before driving on. Emily laughed it off, said it was probably nothing, and maybe it was. But there was something about the way everyone seemed to be watching, quietly measuring them. They learned about the HOA gradually, first in passing comments, then in the thick, rule-packed welcome packet that arrived in their mailbox each month. Jake skimmed it, frowning at the endless pages of restrictions, the exact paint colors allowed, how tall the grass could be, what hours trash bins could sit at the curb. It felt excessive, but they figured it was just the price of living somewhere nice. And for a while, life rolled on. But beneath that surface calm, tension was quietly building, a subtle pressure, like the air right before a storm. Jake could feel it, even if he couldn't name it yet. It was in the way neighbors' smiles flickered when he parked his old truck in the driveway, in the way the HOA newsletter started mentioning community standards more often. They didn't know it yet, but something was coming. And once it hit, nothing about Willow Creek would ever feel peaceful again.
At first, it came as a letter, printed on crisp white paper tucked neatly into their mailbox. Notice of violation. Jake blinked at it over his morning coffee. The wording was cold, clipped, and so polite it felt almost sinister. The violation? Non-compliant porch furniture. The new bench he'd set out, the one he'd spent an entire weekend sanding and staining, didn't meet the HOA's approved style guidelines. Emily laughed. They're mad about a bench? But Jake wasn't laughing. Something about the tone of that letter scratched at him. It wasn't a suggestion or even a request. It was a warning. And at the bottom, in bold letters, failure to comply may result in fines. He moved the bench into the garage, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, another letter came. This time, the grass on the side of their driveway was allegedly overgrown. Jake had mowed the day before. He walked out, checked the patch himself. It barely brushed his ankle. but the letter included a photograph, time-stamped, of their yard from the street. Someone had taken it. That night, as he sat on the porch, he noticed a car creeping by. It slowed almost to a stop, headlights washing over the house. Jake locked eyes with the driver, an older man in a polo shirt and a stiff smile, before the car rolled on. When Jake brought it up to the neighbors, they exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Grant lowered her voice and said, "That's probably Richard, HOA president. He notices things." The way she said it made Jake's skin prickle. Soon the letters multiplied. A friendly reminder about their trash bin being visible from the street. A citation for excessive barking from their dog, even though they were home all day and knew he barely made a sound. Every letter came with the same clipped phrasing, the same threat of fines. Then came the fine. $150. No warning this time, just a bill claiming unauthorized exterior modifications. When Jake called the number on the letterhead, a woman answered with the flat tone of someone who had practiced sounding uninterested. "You installed solar lights. They're little stake lights from the hardware store. They're barely visible. They weren't approved by the design committee." And just like that, the line went dead. Emily wanted to let it go, but Jake couldn't. He felt like they were being stalked, hunted even. Every move they made was watched, measured, and reported. So he went to the next HOA meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, a polished little building with glass walls and lemon-scented air. The moment Jake walked in, the chatter dulled. A dozen people sat around a long table, papers stacked in front of them. At the head was Richard, the same man Jake had seen in the car, silver hair combed razor straight, hands folded like a judge about to deliver a sentence. Jake explained the letters, the fines, the photos. Richard listened without blinking. "Rules maintain order. Without them, this community would fall apart. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I just want to live here. We bought this place to have peace." Richard's eyes sharpened. "Peace comes from conformity." That word lodged like a thorn in Jake's mind. By the time he left the meeting, he knew they weren't just enforcing rules. They were trying to break him. The harassment escalated. One morning they woke to find a bright orange sticker slapped on their front door. "Final notice. Grass non-compliance." The lawn had been mowed the day before. Jake stormed outside, heart pounding, only to see Richard's car parked at the end of the street, idling. The moment Jake made eye contact, it drove off. Emily started checking the windows at night. Their dog barked at shadows. Jake stopped sitting on the porch. Then came the fence. They had been planning to install a simple wooden fence for privacy, nothing fancy. They submitted the design form like the HOA required, expecting it to be a formality. Instead, they got a rejection stamped in red ink, visually disruptive, denied. Jake tried to appeal. The board ignored him. A week later, he found a printed flyer on his windshield announcing a community beautification review, and their property was listed as the first concern. That night, as the sun sank behind the hills, Jake stood in the yard and stared at the house. The porch was bare, the lights removed, the lawn trimmed to perfection. They had followed every demand. Still, it wasn't enough. And then, something strange happened. A neighbor he barely knew, an older woman named Karen from 3 streets over, knocked on their door. Her eyes darted like she was afraid of being seen. "They did this to me too," she whispered. "It starts small, then they bleed you dry. You either bend or you leave." Before Jake could reply, she hurried off into the night. That conversation gnawed at Jake. He started keeping notes. Every letter, every photo, every bizarre citation. He mapped the times cars slowed in front of their house, marked the dates of every warning. A pattern was forming, like a noose tightening. Then one morning he found their mailbox standing open and empty.
The flag was down. The mail they were expecting never arrived. When Jake called the post office, they said the HOA had reported their mailbox as non-compliant and requested a hold on their delivery until it was replaced. No notice, no approval from them, just silence. Jake's hands shook as he hung up the phone. This wasn't about grass. It wasn't about rules. They were being erased. Emily begged him to let it go, to keep their heads down, but something inside Jake snapped. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the slow erosion of his sense of home, but he wasn't going to disappear quietly. He started showing up to meetings with a camera running. He asked for written documentation of every citation, demanded names on the complaints. Richard's calm mask began to crack. Board members shifted in their seats, muttering. Then came the breaking point. A letter, thicker than the rest, sealed in a heavy envelope. Inside was a notice of intent to lien. If they didn't pay $2,300 in cumulative fines for grass, lights, unauthorized vehicle storage, and general non-compliance, the HOA would place a lien on their home. Their home. Emily cried that night. Jake didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at the letter, while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Something had to give. And when it did, Willow Creek would never be the same.
The morning of the hearing, the air felt heavy, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Jake stood in front of the mirror, tying the same tie he'd worn at his father's funeral. His hands shook, but not from fear, from rage. Weeks of humiliation had boiled down to this moment. The HOA had pushed them into a corner with fines, threats, and harassment, and now they were trying to take the house entirely. Emily sat at the kitchen table, pale but steady. The lien threat had become real, a foreclosure petition delivered by courier in a thick manila envelope. If they didn't pay within 30 days, the HOA could auction off their home. Jake had spent every night since then digging. While the HOA sent their letters and final notices, Jake had been building something of his own, a mountain of evidence. He'd filed public records requests, tracked down past residents who'd left suddenly, pulled HOA financial statements, and combed through their bylaws line by line. What he found was worse than he imagined. Richard, the HOA president, had been quietly issuing fines without board approval, thousands of dollars worth, and funneling a percentage of collection fees through a management company that listed his own sister as the registered agent. It was theft, but proving it would mean going to war. So Jake sharpened his plan like a blade. He hired a lawyer, a quiet, stone-faced woman named Carla, who smiled like she already knew the ending. And together, they prepared their counterattack. The HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting to address chronic violations at Jake and Emily's property. But when Jake walked into the glass-walled clubhouse that night, he wasn't the same man who had once stood there begging to be left alone. He was done begging. The room was packed. Neighbors lined the walls, some curious, some pretending not to stare. At the head of the table sat Richard, flanked by the board, all stiff collars and cold stares. A stack of folders sat in front of him like evidence waiting for a verdict. Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Carson," he used Jake's last name like a weapon, "this board has reviewed your continued pattern of non-compliance. We are prepared to move forward with enforcement, including foreclosure proceedings if necessary." Jake didn't sit. He placed a single black binder on the table. "I think you're going to want to hear what I found first." Richard's smile faltered. He opened the binder. Inside were copies of every violation notice they'd ever received, and beside them, documents showing the HOA's own bylaws requiring board approval for fines over $200. None of the fines had board signatures. Then came the financial statements, a paper trail showing thousands of dollars paid to Creekside Management LLC, a company registered to a P.O. box linked to Richard's sister. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. "This is slander," Richard snapped, but Jake cut him off. "This is fraud, and every person in this room has been paying for it." Gasps broke out. Board members shifted uneasily. Jake kept going. He revealed testimony from 3 former residents who left after similar harassment, all of whom described receiving fabricated violations until they sold their homes under pressure. He showed an email leaked by one of the board members who had quietly turned on Richard, where Richard wrote, "We can't let standards slip. Better to push out problem owners early." The room went silent. Then Jake pulled out the last piece, a cease and desist letter, signed by Carla, citing breach of fiduciary duty, harassment, and embezzlement. If the HOA proceeded with foreclosure, they would be met with a lawsuit seeking personal damages from every board member who had knowingly approved Richard's actions. Richard's face went pale. His hands trembled as he reached for his papers, but Jake wasn't finished. "By the way," Jake said, turning toward the cluster of neighbors filming on their phones, "this meeting is being recorded, and this evidence has already been sent to the county attorney's office." That's when the room erupted. Half the board started shouting at Richard. One of them stood up, red-faced, and demanded his resignation on the spot. Neighbors who had been silent for months now raised their voices, furious, realizing they had all been paying inflated dues and bogus fines. Richard slammed his gavel, shouting for order, but his voice cracked. And then something no one expected happened. Karen, the older woman who had once warned Jake to bend or leave, rose from her seat in the back. She lifted a manila folder above her head. "I have proof too," she said, voice shaking but loud. "He did this to me 3 years ago. He took my house." The room froze. Karen walked forward and set her folder next to Jake's. Inside were letters, receipts, and the deed transfer from when she had been forced to sell, at a suspiciously low price, to a shell buyer later linked back to Richard's management company. It was the killing blow. The board fractured instantly. 2 members stormed out. One began sobbing quietly into her hands, and Richard just sat there, staring at nothing, as the foundation he'd built his power on crumbled underneath him. Jake didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply gathered his binder, nodded once to Carla, and turned to leave. Behind him, the room dissolved into chaos. People shouting, cell phones buzzing as word spread across Willow Creek like wildfire. As Jake stepped out into the cool night air, Emily caught his hand. She hadn't said a word the entire time, but her grip trembled with adrenaline and relief. They walked home silently. The next morning, everything changed. Emails flooded the neighborhood group chat. A petition demanding Richard's removal spread like wildfire. Neighbors Jake had never spoken to stopped him on the sidewalk, thanking him, some even apologizing for staying silent. The board announced an emergency vote, but Richard didn't wait for it. By the end of the week, he was gone. His house stood dark and empty, a for sale sign staked in the perfect lawn like a white flag. For the first time in months, the street felt quiet. Still, Jake knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The HOA wasn't just Richard. It was a system. And systems don't die easy. But that night, as he stood on his porch, the same porch where it all began, he set the bench back where it belonged. For once, nobody drove by to take a picture. And deep down, he knew the real battle was about to begin.
The days after Richard's fall felt surreal. For months, Jake and Emily had lived like suspects in their own neighborhood, checking windows, whispering late at night, bracing for the next blow. But now, silence. No more letters, no more cars idling at the curb, just the wind moving gently through the oaks and the hum of sprinklers clicking on at dawn. It was over, or at least it seemed like it. Richard's resignation hit the community like a shockwave. One morning, his blinds were drawn, and by nightfall, a for sale sign stood in the middle of his flawless front lawn. The same man who had ruled every detail of Willow Creek, from mailbox paint colors to the height of the grass, had vanished overnight, leaving nothing behind but a trail of suspicion and unanswered questions. But the real storm came afterward. Carla, their attorney, didn't stop when Richard left. She filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Community Affairs, attaching every document Jake had gathered, and every one of Karen's too. The investigation launched quickly and quietly, like a fuse burning towards something explosive. Over the next month, the neighborhood board collapsed from the inside. First, 2 members resigned, claiming they had no knowledge of Richard's financial scheme. Then another admitted to signing blank fine sheets at his request, trusting him to fill in the details later. That revelation cracked everything wide open. Soon, state auditors moved in. They demanded years of HOA financial records, board meeting minutes, and emails. Neighbors who had once been too scared to speak started lining up to give statements. Some had been fined into selling their homes. Others admitted they had paid compliance fees in cash directly to Richard to make violations disappear. The picture that emerged was uglier than anyone had imagined. Richard hadn't just abused his power. He'd turned the HOA into his own private revenue stream. The investigation confirmed tens of thousands of dollars in bogus fines and kickbacks siphoned off through the management company under his sister's name. He had used fear to make everyone obedient. But fear only works until someone fights back. By the time the state announced formal charges, Richard was gone. His house sat hollow and dark, the perfect lawn going patchy in the sun as if even the grass had stopped trying. Jake watched it all from his porch, the bench finally back where it belonged. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to keep his home. But neighbors he'd barely known now crossed the street to shake his hand. Some even thanked him with trembling voices, admitting they had wanted to push back for years but hadn't dared. It was strange being seen. Emily noticed the difference first. Kids started playing in the cul-de-sac again. The Millers planted new roses. The Grants invited them over for dinner, not out of politeness, but out of genuine warmth. Something in Willow Creek had shifted. The board, now reduced to just 2 surviving members, called a community-wide meeting to rebuild. This time, the clubhouse wasn't filled with tension, but hope. Neighbors debated new bylaws, voted on transparency rules, and demanded financial audits. They dissolved Richard's old beautification committee, the very one he had used as a weapon, and replaced it with a voluntary maintenance fund. For the first time, people weren't afraid of the HOA. They were part of it. Karen, who had once stood trembling in Jake's doorway warning him to bend or leave, now sat on the new board as treasurer. She spoke softly but firmly, her hands steady as she outlined a plan to repay residents who had been wronged. And when she was done, she turned to Jake. "We wouldn't be here without you." Jake didn't know what to say. The truth is, it had nearly broken him. The endless nights of planning, the stress, the feeling of being hunted in his own home had left scars. Even now, when headlights swept across the windows at night, his chest tightened out of habit. But when he looked around the room, at the neighbors who had once watched him with suspicion, now nodding in support, he realized something. It had been worth it. Not because he had won. There were no trophies here, no banners declaring victory, but because Willow Creek had changed. It wasn't perfect anymore. Lawns weren't all the same length. A few mailboxes didn't match. Someone even painted their door red, something Richard would have fined them for on site. And somehow it all looked better, more alive. Months passed. The state wrapped up its investigation, issuing restitution orders to the victims and banning Richard from holding any HOA office in the state again. He was never seen in Willow Creek after that. Rumor had it he had fled to another county, trying to start over. No one cared enough to find out. Life settled back into rhythm. Emily planted a vegetable garden in the backyard. Their dog sprawled on the porch every afternoon, soaking up the sun without anyone snapping secret photos. Jake went back to his work, long hours but lighter somehow, like the weight on his chest had finally lifted. But every so often he'd catch a neighbor glancing at their house, not with suspicion now, but something else. Admiration, maybe? Or gratitude? Sometimes people stopped to ask how he'd done it, how he'd found the courage. And Jake always gave the same answer. I just got tired of being afraid. Because that was the heart of it. Fear is what had kept everyone silent. Fear of fines, of gossip, of losing their homes. Fear had been the real fence around Willow Creek, taller than any the bylaws allowed. But once fear breaks, it can't be rebuilt. That was the real victory. Not just keeping their house, but proving that even the smallest voice could be louder than the rules meant to silence it. It became a quiet kind of legend in the neighborhood. People called it the bench war, the fight that started over something small, but changed everything. And if you drove down that winding road into Willow Creek today, you'd see it. A simple wooden bench sitting on a porch at the edge of the valley, sun-worn and stubborn. It's not perfectly stained anymore. It doesn't match the approved color palette. And no one dares to tell him to move it. Because that bench means something now. It means this is their home, and they're not afraid anymore.